This is an issue that we're going to be covering today. That is something that we have been talking about for regarding African aviation for so long. And the key question that we're going to try to get to the bottom of over this period of time is, how can we change the narrative and the reality of high costs for African aviation? So this is something that my esteemed panelists are going to be taking us through. And of course, we count on your participation from the audience with questions and comments as we go through. So without further ado, let me first start with our OEM panel session members. For Michal, Olivier and Rui, I would like to know first and foremost how COVID-19 has affected your business, and what would you say is the future of aircraft orders in the next 3 to 5 years? Let me start with you, Rui.
Thanks very much, Funke. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, very well. Thank you. You can speak up a little bit just so that the audience can hear you clearly as well. Thank you.
Great, thanks for the opportunity to talk here. And I think the impact of COVID, as all the panelists and all the speakers have highlighted, has been a tremendous impact on the entire industry, including at Boeing. Right at the start, we had to close our factories for a while we made them safe for the workers to operate there. And then as the pandemic has gone on and the airlines, our customers, have been affected, we have reduced our production rates. We have consolidated, in fact, the 787 production into a single location. And of course, we've had to also make redundancies at Boeing. People have taken voluntary layoffs. There have been some involuntary ones as well. So we're also downsizing and trying to adjust to the new normal. But we do see that this is a resilient industry, and going forward, it will recover. So the reduction is a temporary one for, say, the next 3-4 years or so. And then we expect things to get better. But certainly in the next few years, it's going to be a slightly slower pace of orders and activity.
Thank you, Rui. So it seems like you're saying it's going to be tougher before it gets better. Olivier?
Yes, did you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah,
I can hear you clearly.
Yeah, I fully agree with my colleague from Boeing. This is exactly what we see also from our side. We are impacted, of course, by the different delivery deferrals, for example, for airlines that try to survive in this extremely difficult time. So we had a lot of discussion with, of course, our customer in order to spread a little bit the deliveries all over the next coming months. And we expect, of course, that the next 1, 2, or 3 years will be, if you want, slowing down compared to what we used to see in the past year.
Michal? Hello? Okay, it seems that we don't have Michal. Michal, I'm from Embraer. Are you there?
All right. There. Just a couple of seconds to get his microphone on.
Okay, that's fine. While we're waiting for him, Sanjiv, if you can just maybe start to prep as well for this question, but from quite a broader perspective, given the fact that you're an consultant.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can, Olivier, and I think everyone can too.
This is Michal. This is Michal now. I think I was now promoted to the panelist finally. Yeah, so very quickly answering your first question, I think it would be unfair for me to complain, because I presume most of our audience is airlines, and most of them have taken a hit of 80, 90, if not 100% of revenues. We haven't been hit so hard, but of course, again, it's I cannot say that things are as normal. We have thankfully not witnessed any cancellations yet, only deferrals. We do also have other lines of business like defense and executive jets, which keep us afloat. But of course, we needed to adapt, so we had to right size as well. We are a smaller team now, but we do see light at the end of this tunnel. we remain somehow positive and optimistic. We do see that our segment that we dominated in the past, now the segment itself should come out of this crisis stronger and more relevant. So there's a lot of good energy here.
Interesting. All right, Sanjiv, from a different perspective, given that you maybe have a bit of a bird's eye view over the industry, do you have any thoughts in terms of what the next 3 to 5 years are going to look like, particularly for African aviation?
Sure, and good afternoon all. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. So I think like the other panelists have said, it's going to take at least 3 to 4 years for aviation to get back on its feet fully. Domestic markets, so countries which have large domestic markets, will start recovering maybe in the next year or so. Some countries have already started recovering. They're flying 60 to 70% of what they used to fly earlier. China, of course, is flying as much as last year. But on average, I think in the next year or so, domestic market should substantially come back. International will take a bit longer, and a full recovery back to 2019 levels, probably 3 to 4 years out, is what I think most people are believing now. Now, the challenge in Africa, of course, is that there are very few large domestic markets. So obviously that means that with border controls and quarantine requirements, etc., the comeback for African aviation, African carriers will probably tend towards the longer side of the spectrum. It won't be in the next 1 year, but it might be the next 2, 3, or 4 years. So that's where I see it at a 30,000 foot level.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Some really interesting points there, all of you. One is that, the next 3 to 5 years are going to be a period where the whole industry is going to need to hunker down and really dig deep to try to pull out, the reserves and really try to change the dynamic in terms of how to continue to survive. Thriving will be some time to come, but survival for now is going to be the real focus for us. The other thing that you just mentioned, Sanjiv, which is quite interesting for us all to know, is the impact of a recovery on aviation, and of course on the issue we're going to talk about today, which is on cost. I mean, a recovery really helps the airline revenues pick up, which supports their ability to sustain operations and so on, and also the entire value chain. So it's a really critical element. And for now, because of those border controls that you mentioned, which effectively keep a lot of the source markets, between Africa and the rest of the world, and even intra-Africa, largely depressed, it's going to be quite an interesting issue. Now let's focus now on our topic on cost, and just a few remarks for the sake of the audience and our panelists, just to set the scene properly. The cost of aviation in Africa has been prohibitive for a very long time, and it's been amongst the highest in the world. As at this time last year, just a few months before the pandemic hit, taxes and charges in Africa were about 35% higher than the rest of the world, while fuel costs represented about 40% more. For international travel today, AFRA reminded us during the course of this AGM that taxes and fees at departure represent an average of around $64 per passenger. And out of 53 airports in Africa, 32 charge over $50 per passenger, while 10 airports charge over $100 per passenger. The average amount of charges in Central and West African airports, ranges between 758 and 700 and just slightly less. And that exceeds the continental average of $624 and exceeds, the global average of much less. So South Africa apparently is the least expensive region with an average of $514. These are big numbers, and these are numbers that we need to consider, especially as we are re-emerging through this crisis, this unprecedented crisis, on how we really can change both that narrative and the reality. And as mentioned, as the industry and economies restart, cost is going to be an overriding issue for the users of aviation, the passengers and their cargo. Before the pandemic, we had about 10% of Africa's population flying, which is about 100 million people. Cost is now more than ever before an overriding consideration for whether somebody will buy a ticket to fly. So going into my next question, given the fact that COVID-19 has severely impacted this industry financially, the worst crisis that we've ever seen, do you see a strategic opportunity here for the aviation industry ecosystem to address the issue of cost in Africa? And if so, how do you see this playing out? Let me start with you, Sanjiv, and then I'll run through with the rest of the panelists.
Yeah, I think this COVID crisis actually gives us a chance to go back to the drawing board and completely reinvent how we look at aviation, both from a regulatory perspective, a tax perspective, government perspective, and also how the airlines look at it. I think cost has got two aspects to it. The aspect you've talked about is very important. The taxes and fees, they can really cripple an industry like aviation. I've seen in my experience that airports and countries that lower the taxes and lower the airport charges see a more than 100% return on that investment in terms of traffic growth. So whatever the governments can do to reduce taxes, tariffs, whatever the airports can do, with the long-term goal of increasing traffic in mind, is certainly going to help the industry. But I think more fundamentally, we have to look also at the fact that in order to get cost economies or to get cost advantages, airlines need to have scale. And airlines in Africa, with a very few exceptions, do not have scale. And in order to get scale, you need to have a market large enough to serve. For that, borders need to come down, or border controls need to be reduced. So even when you get past COVID, if Africa can succeed in creating, a single travel zone like the EU or like India has, India and Africa are actually very similar population, similar per capita income. But India carries almost 70% more passengers within India than all of Africa. So if airlines can get the scale, which they can get through better market access, less regulation, more freedom to travel between borders, then they can get scale economies and bring the cost down from that as well. So I think both on the regulatory front, taxation front, and on the demand generation and reduction of barriers to travel front, there's a lot that can be done to help airlines scale up and bring the cost down and become competitive and stimulate demand, and becomes a virtuous cycle.
Okay. That's a great point that you raised, that there are two sides to the story. So there's the side of the government, and of course, everyone would urge governments to bring the cost down, wouldn't they? But regarding the cost to the airlines of operating aircraft, purchasing aircraft, the leasing, the maintenance, etc. I mean, this is where you, as the OEMs, come in. So let me start with Michal. If you can, speak to what these issues are. What can the airlines do to bring down their costs in this tricky period over the next 3 years, which is what we've said is the horizon for us to survive?
It's a very valid question, because as much as I would never say that the regulatory environment is not relevant, you have always a limited influence of what this environment will be. And I would urge everyone to start with themselves and make sure that they bring efficiency in their operations, because I think this is the starting point, absolutely necessary. And when looking at and thinking about African markets and thinking what are the biggest levers that airline might have, I tend to look at the commercial side of the business, and actually, namely utilization and load factor. These are two biggest levers that airline can have, because it impacts the unit cost of every single other category, be it fuel, be it navigation charges. If you want to translate it to the unit cost per passenger or per flight hour, you have to address the issue of utilization, average utilization of your assets, and then load factors. So all across Africa, the load factors historically, we know, been in the mid-60s, which is significantly below what you can observe on the more mature markets, where you have 80, 50. If you bridge this gap, instantly you reduce your cost per passenger by 20-25%. So this is, in essence, as if you almost entirely introduce it would be the same savings as if you introduce the aircraft that ran on water, because you virtually could eliminate the cost of fuel. So these are two basic issues that should be also quite, I'm not going to say easy, But with a solid strategy, with the right approach to fleet planning, network planning, a little bit more conservative approach, maybe less of a wishful thinking, it can be addressed. And I think the post-COVID period can be used to reset those strategies and reset the approach we design strategies, networks, and fleet, and work on those two parameters.
Very good. Thank you. Rui, any thoughts on this particular point? What can the airlines do to reduce costs in this period?
So I think there's quite a few things that the airlines can look at in terms of optimizing operations, automating. We just had a session talking about automation, going digital where possible. So there are many aspects there that are allowing airlines to reduce costs. And then we know we have tools that we can offer the airlines to look at how to optimize your flight plans, for example, to minimize fuel burn, to optimize the maintenance plan. So we, the manufacturers, we know the aircraft well. We can help the airlines to look at the maintenance plan and how to reduce the costs on the maintenance side. And then also, I think in terms of the fleet, what we've seen elsewhere in the world is airlines are retiring the least efficient fleets in their aircraft in their fleet. And I think that's something that's important. In Africa, there are still a number of older aircraft in operation. And this crisis gives the opportunity to replace some of those older, much older aircraft, 30, 40-year-old aircraft, replace those with more efficient types at a cheaper cost than they would have been in the past.
Okay, great. Olivier, while you answer the same question, I'd also like you to start out on what you think that the other members of the ecosystem can do. I mean, if you think about aviation sort of being in the middle of a big cake, and everyone sort of is around aviation, the airlines, eating a piece of that cake, and the airlines sort of get the last pieces of the crumbs. So what do you think that the rest of the ecosystem can do to support the airlines? Because the airlines actually support that ecosystem. And we've seen that so graphically play out during this COVID crisis, where the airports suffered because the borders were closed and airlines were not flying. The civil aviation authorities, the airspace providers, the fuelers, the caterers, everyone was impacted just by the inability of airlines, to take to the skies. So while you also, address what your ideas are on how airlines can bring down their costs, maybe you can also speak to this issue, and then I'll, loop it back to Sanjiv. So Olivier, over to you.
Yeah, thanks. So yeah, concerning the options that are available for airline, I would say that one of the first, maybe the most important element is to have real business planning. That's important to have something robust and bankable, to define a clear strategy. Airline business is something extremely difficult to be profitable. So that's why it's important to have a real clear strategy. And maybe here we know that different business models emerge in different countries of the world, like the LCC, the full service carrier. You have the ultra low cost carrier coming from Asia, coming from Europe. Maybe here, Africa has to define its own business model, a business model which is more linked to the market specificities and market segments of Africa. Large population, very poor propensity to travel, the problem of the income, the secondary airports sometimes that are difficult. So the business model of the African carrier doesn't have to be only a copy-paste of something that works in other places. So, but again, everything is based on the real business planning and real strategy defined for the airline. Now, concerning of the other ecosystem, yeah, that's the airline is just a small piece of the cake. There is an advantage in Africa for me is that, in fact, the governments are controlling the different part of this ecosystem. Governments are in charge of airlines, but also take control of the airports, is responsible for the visa policy, for the traffic rights, for the allocation of the slots to the competition. And of course, it's extremely important to be sure that there is a clear collaboration between these different parts of the air transport ecosystem. And the air transport ecosystem is also part of a bigger cake, which is the economy. And the air transport is very important, of course, for the tourism in certain cases. If you take Mauritius, Seychelles, but also Kenya, Tanzania, Egypt, Morocco, they all depend on the tourist activity, and tourists are coming most of the time by planes. So investing in an airline or supporting an airline is just one part of the equation. You also need maybe to help the airline by making strong promotion, developing tourism infrastructure or ground infrastructure, for example. So all the other elements that will help the airlines is also good for the economy. And of course, as the African government are controlling all these ecosystems, they are also controlling charges. So helping an airline, it's not only supporting by budgeting the airline, but it's also by helping them and giving the airline the real potential to grow by lowering the charge and the fees.
Great. I mean, I love the point you've made there about expanding that ecosystem and really trying to help the airline industry through support with affiliated industries like tourism and hospitality. So Sanjiv, do you agree with what's been said so far? And what else do you think, now going to the point that Olivier raised about government's role in this issue? What do you think that governments can actually do, in addition to what he's mentioned, to help bring down the cost for airlines and really make it a bigger pie that spreads around not just the ecosystem, but also the economy?
Yeah, so I think, I completely agree with my fellow panelists. There's a lot that each airline can individually do to run more efficient operations and lower the internal cost structures. But I come back to my fundamental point, which is that this is a scale industry. And short of consolidation and mergers, which of course will not be easy across borders and takes time, I think what I would urge the airlines or some of the smaller airlines, or even the larger ones, to think about, along with their respective governments, is to allow the airlines to have some kind of alliance or partnership with some kind of antitrust immunity, so that they can do some kind of joint purchasing and some kind of joint negotiations of contracts, so that they can together provide the kind of scale required in order to get better cost offers or better contracts, lower the costs. Now, when I say this, I think those on the other side of the equation, rest of the value chain, may not necessarily agree with me, because for them it means improving the contracts. But I think they would also probably agree if it results in the industry being stronger, more resilient, less prone to failure, better credit risks, etc. So maybe both sides, the suppliers and the airlines and the governments, all three sides, can get together and say, look, let us help this industry get healthier. Let us allow the airlines to form some alliances, give them some antitrust immunity, and let us explain the benefits of that to the rest of the ecosystem, so that they understand the value of having fewer, stronger alliance-based airlines, and bring the entire risk of the industry down along with the cost structure. So I think we need to go beyond thinking of the micro, that let me do this and that with my individual airline and contract, and start thinking about fundamental structural change in how the airline industry works together, how you bring about virtual scale, if not literal scale, and how the partners and suppliers can actually benefit and cooperate and together achieve a better, healthier industry with lower costs.
That's a really interesting point. I hope that all of our suppliers are listening closely to this. But you raise a very valid point, and that brings me to the next point that I wanted to tease out of all of you. This goes to the importance of having the right regulatory framework. We all know that aviation is, one of the most closely regulated industries in the world, and this is despite deregulation in specific parts of the world. But I'm talking about the idea and the fact of regulating the carriage of people and goods to ensure that that's being done safely, securely, and sustainably. So aviation has a lot of regulation through all the technical standards, the Chicago Convention, the standards and recommended practices, policy guidance, etc. So we already do, and we do self-regulate because we have to, given the nature of our business. But you've just raised this point now about this example of allowing an alliance to build across the African continent, where you can generate scale and you can also get some benefits from that kind of alliance in terms of, you know, purchasing, in terms of ability to negotiate and things like that. So this is a really important point. For that to happen, you rightly mentioned that there needs to be immunity in terms of competition guidelines. And I'm not sure right now that the competition guidelines, both under the African Civil Aviation policy and the regulatory texts for the single African air transport market, have actually gone as far as you suggest, but there is room for that to happen. So what I'd like to hear from the other panelists is, what other kind of policy changes do you think that governments can do? So we've talked about them lowering charges and taxes, and I think it was Olivier that made the great point that government owns a lot of, you know, that ecosystem. You have governments who own airlines in many cases. You have governments who also own the airports, and you have them, you know, owning some of the other suppliers. So one is that there needs to be a decided and committed position from governments to bring down these taxes and charges, understanding that bringing down taxes and charges helps to the affordability of tickets, which goes to, you know, the income situation for much of Africa. So there's that. We've also heard now from one very good example from Sanjiv about, you know, antitrust immunity. What are the sort of regulatory or policy examples do the others have that you can share with us, that you might have seen that have worked in other regions and perhaps could be replicated here, or something totally novel? Any one of you can start, or if you want, I can pick. Okay, I'll pick. Rui. Hello? Are we still here?
I am with you, Funky. I don't know.
Okay.
My
I think we lost
technical problems.
Great. Okay, go ahead.
I think I couldn't agree more with Sanjiv on the fact that addressing cost is the issue of scale, and then a second component is competition. And this is as simple as this.
Yeah.
So on the competition side, the single market, whether it's going to be Pan-African or in stages, seems the most obvious fact. The more players you have on one market, the more motivated they are to compete. The more they are more motivated to compete, the more they would focus on costs. On the volumes, I was thinking one of the topics that you mentioned in the briefing to this panel, you said we might discuss the relationship between the cost and the level of fares and how they can stimulate the traffic, the volumes, which in turn kind of starts turning this virtuous circle. This is the biggest lever. When I'm thinking about Africa and try to compare it to Europe, in Europe, this low-cost revolution and the low-cost who really stimulated and turbocharged the growth over the last 2 decades, it started around the year 2000 when the propensity to fly in Europe was at around 1.5 passenger per capita. Africa is still way behind this point. So I tend to believe that it is not a market mature enough that the price would be the main stimulant for the volumes. I tend to believe that the factor that would help drive the volume the fastest would be improving the connectivity, the supply of routes, frequencies, new markets. So I tend to believe that any kind of schemes, regulatory or governmental driven schemes that would incentivize new entrants to the market, new for the existing players to incentivize them to open new markets and invest in connectivity. This is where you would have a biggest payoff in terms of the volumes. And then when you have volumes, it's much easier to address costs. This is my philosophy and my way of looking at it.
Interesting. All right, let's go over now to Olivier.
Yeah, I tend to agree on the fact that regulation, especially when we talk about the scale of the airline, which are small scale airlines, if you start to impose a lot of regulation, as the aviation world, generally speaking, is bilateral, if you put some regulation, the government in front of you will also put regulation. So there is probably something, again, to find between a fully open market, which is probably difficult because you need to have very strong airline, and generally speaking, liberalization push to concentrate to certain size, or if you want, of the business model. But it's clear that it's probably important to find something between no real regulation, but probably a certain limitation or control, to be sure that the airline or small airline has the ability, first of all, to grow and to penetrate the market or to define their own business model. And more than regulation, I think as well that there is a possibility to define also and to create some competence center for the air transport or aviation within Africa, more than we have today, in terms of crew certification, in terms of aircraft registration or certification, for example, training center, competence center, maintenance center. That's probably something that will come, that to create a real, again, a real ecosystem, maybe driven by different African governments, but to help them to grow and to develop the competences.
That's a great point. Competencies are really important, and you're suggesting some kind of managed regulatory approach. So that's a very interesting idea there. Is Rui back with us now? Okay, if Rui isn't here, I think both of you, three of you have mentioned this, very important policy underpinning, like an enabler for getting the traffic up and really trying to move the needle, and that is connectivity. So I mentioned earlier the single African air transport market, and we know that this is a policy initiative that following its launch in January 2018, all the stakeholders in Africa have been talking about and actively promoting. AFRA is one of the key proponents, as well as the African industry aviation industry group that many of you are members of. So this is quite an interesting initiative. What do you think that will help to fast track the implementation of the SATAM? And I want to give you a practical example, because we tend to talk about theories. I really want to see how this can be practicalized. Right now, when we look at the traffic movements within Africa and between Africa and the rest of the world, we see that the intra-Africa traffic has picked up quite significantly, which is quite interesting. So it's almost as though the COVID-19 is forcing African governments to open their markets back amongst each other while they await the opening of borders with other key source markets like Europe, the USA, and even some parts of Asia. So we're starting to see this in reality without any sort of fanfare, without any trumpeting of the fact that, oh, Africa is implementing or is going about with opening its markets. It's opening its markets, but still quite on a bilateral basis. It's not quite fifth freedom. So what do you think can really help move this issue forward, can fast track this issue? Because it's, we talk about it, we know all the benefits, but it just doesn't seem to be moving. Who wants to take that? Okay, Boeing and Embraer, last year you were involved in an initiative under the AIG where we came up with business cases that we wanted to showcase why the single African air transport market is important. So it might be interesting if you wanted to speak to some elements of those pieces of work and how you think that we can, as OEMs and also the industry as a whole, can help fast track this issue.
Okay, so Embraer here speaking. Yes. Last year, indeed, we published a study and then talked about the study highlighting the benefits of SATAM, and I think there's no doubt about it. At least there should not be doubt about the benefits to the connectivity, to the stimulation of traffic volumes. You name it. It's not a matter of opinion. It's a matter of fact. Yeah, it has been seen and proven in other parts of the world many times. If I understand correctly, Funke, your question is also focusing what can or what might be the obstacles why we're not implementing it faster.
Yes.
I don't know all the details and complexities of the politics involved in Africa. I can maybe think of my observation from the region from which I am coming from, Europe, and some discussion that I've witnessed there. So I think no one is questioning the macro effect on the volumes and the efficiency of the single market in its totality. But the challenge was always how you ensure the level playing field on this market. And why a single market succeeded in European Union and United States and also on transatlantic is, in my opinion, mainly because there was a lot of focus put into the place to regulate the competition law and making sure that no one remains disadvantaged here. In Africa, the main challenge from my perspective is that we do need government in this industry. I tend to even say that the governmental ownership at this stage of the market development can be very good. So how we regulate the competition between governments so that one airline is not disadvantaged versus the other, this is the key issue that has to go in parallel to talking about the liberalization, because without it, many players would rightfully oppose it because they will say, yeah, that's a great idea, but why I have to pay for the greater good and the others take all the benefits.
Interesting. Olivier, you also had a study for Africa, a white paper on Africa. So perhaps you want to talk about that a bit before I go to Sanjiv.
Yeah, I agree. There's probably a lot of political complexity, which is not specifically linked to the air transport. But today, the key issue, if you are an airline, is because of this closed market, you are forced to operate aircraft that are not economically viable. You operate, for example, a wide body on a given route because you cannot increase your frequency, so you put the bigger capacity you have, and it comes with a cost. Who is losing there is everyone, in fact, government or the airline and so on. So how to open and how to do it, I agree, it's quite difficult, but we could imagine that there is a creation of certain corridor of liberalization between certain countries or certain group of countries that probably have the same interest, let's say, for example, between Senegal, Ivory Coast, Nigeria, and so on, or between Kenya and all the Southern Africa, to create some kind of liberalization. And I'm quite optimistic, and I would tend to say that it's probably lead by example. If some example of liberalization succeed, then it will probably create a wave of more liberalization on the African sky.
Thank you. That's a great idea. And I think that, so to all the participants who are listening and all the stakeholders, there's quite a lot of work that is being done. By different stakeholders, by AFCAC, by the African Union, and our industry group on this issue. So we'll be feeding all of this information and ideas into that piece of work. Now, before I go further, I think that just to close the loop on this particular point, Sanjiv, if you want to weigh in here, and then I have some questions from the audience, some really interesting questions that have come from the participants. So Sanjiv, any final thoughts?
I just wanted to, again, I guess, reemphasize the fact that COVID is actually providing a situation or an opportunity. You never let a crisis go to waste.
Yeah.
So I think the near-death experience of the industry, the fact that governments around the world have had to put in billions of dollars in some cases, to support their airlines and the business, should provide some kind of, catalyst for all other governments around the world, including in Africa, other parts of Asia, etc., to say, look, let's create a situation where we strengthen our airlines so that we are never having to be in a position where we need to bail them out or see them fail. So I think COVID has created a situation where government should really be willing now to say, we need to rethink how we look at the business, how we look at regulations, and just completely change the way we've done it in the past, remove the barriers, allow airlines to build scale, take out unnecessary regulations, taxes, and fees, allow them to be commercially competitive, etc. So this is the time. I don't think there's a better time to do it than now.
Okay, excellent. Thanks for the wrap up. So
can I just add a point, if I may?
Go ahead.
It's not it's just something it come to my mind when we are discussing, because we talk about the issue in Africa between the cost and the regulation. And for me, there's also something which is very important, which is between regulation and the cost. Today, for African airlines, it's extremely difficult to access to finance. The financing sources, it's a real issue for the growth and the development of the most of the African carriers. There is probably a need to have a real African aviation partners that help to promote, for example, leasing aircraft capabilities, or there is probably the need to arrange or to develop strong partnership with other international leasing companies, because there is a strong need, and we have a lot of customers and airlines are suffering for the lack of financing condition for African carriers, and they need to be helped, not for us as an OEM, but also by the financing community, which by any chance is also part or in the hand of the government.
Very good point indeed. I think that's a critical element to it. While on the one hand we talk about the cost, I mean, how is it that the airlines will finance themselves? And I think that's a really interesting point. And yesterday during the CEO forum, one of the CEOs on the panel mentioned the idea of banding together as airlines to approach financing institutions, not just the winner takes all mentality that we have and we see across the region, but really trying to expand the scope of cooperation, not just for technical or commercial reasons, but also to access finance. So that's quite an interesting point you've raised there. Do we have Rui back with us?
Adefunke, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
I'm here.
Okay, great.
Great.
Yeah. So we talked about, the SATAM as a policy enabler, and I know that, you were involved in the work that Boeing did last year in terms of the study for the number of states to see how we can get some of the business enablers like financiers and leasing companies to support this issue. Tomorrow, during the Aeropolitical Forum of the AIG, we're going to have somebody who's going to be speaking on that issue, having consolidated all the work that you've done. So I know that, Boeing is supportive of the SATAM initiative, but Olivier has just raised a very interesting issue that we hadn't talked about before, which is the point around access to finance. How the airlines in Africa in particular can really break this ceiling that keeps hanging over them to access finance in a meaningful way, for them to really help, try to generate some of the scale that Sanjiv and the rest of you have talked about earlier.
Yeah, absolutely. That was one of the issues I was going to raise under the government point. For example, the ratifying Cape Town Convention is one way that the governments can help the airlines get access to cheaper financing, for example. So I think that's critical. In Boeing, we've seen that there's a view of a higher risk in Africa in general. And so part of what we do is try to educate financiers and hold events to explain the market in Africa, the potential. And I think there's things that the airlines can do themselves to help that as well, to put in place proper accounting practices, good governance practices. All of these will help to reduce the perception of risk and impact on the financing. And talking about risk, one of the other points I was going to raise was about which the governments again can push, is the safety oversight of the airline and the airline industry, which again then helps on the insurance premiums reducing, and so risk perception there as well. So I think that there are a number of areas there where the governments can help, where the airlines can do things themselves to explain, and of course, and I think that the World Bank with IMF to explain the strategic objective of the airlines, the importance to the economies. I think that's also critical to ensure that there's adequate financing available for the airlines.
Great points. Thank you for that. So we have two quite interesting questions that speak to all of you directly as OEMs. The one is on cost, and it's an example from another region or country, how that government decided to help its airlines. And basically, this is an example from China, where the government decided to give the airlines a 3-month tax-free for the recovery of, the impact of COVID-19, to help them reconstitute their cash flow position. So the question to you guys is, will the aircraft manufacturers be willing to help their customers by waiving your own fee for the same duration?
Please allow me to interrupt.
Funke,
we need to wrap up.
The government's working directly
sure.
with the.
We'll be finishing in the next few minutes.
Explain the strategic objective of the.
All right, so if we can quickly hear back from you all on this particular point, what do you all plan to do to support the airlines? It doesn't just have to be on the issue of waiver of fees, but that's the specific question. So what do you all plan to do on that point?
Okay, let me go first again.
Yes, please. And let's just go quickly because of the time.
Okay.
We have 2 more minutes.
I think the first and foremost, we need to manage our cost as well, because the more efficient we are, the more we can give back to our customers, and this is what we are doing through the analysis. Point number 2, I think we'll just continue do what we were doing, and I think there will be many members of our audience and participants today who would testify that our team on the ground in Africa with Gad, Daniel, Chico, they all really go extra mile beyond what would be expected from a typical, salesperson or marketing person, to address various types of needs of our customers, and we will just continue to do so. We have the most valuable thing that we have is our time and our resources, and we want to dedicate it to support airlines. Third thing, we offer our consulting. I mean, this is the time to reset the strategies in aviation, and we're happy to discuss and plan the future. And fourth and final, which touches upon the discussion on financing. I also tend to believe that the problem or the challenge of financing will be slightly smaller, in a sense that historically pre-COVID, when the entire world was booming, aviation world, the supply of the second-hand, reasonably young, efficient aircraft was limited, because those other markets were soaking up everything. I think right now, for the liquidity of a mid-life aircraft is getting better, and the price point is getting where it needs to be, and this is where Embraer can really support for airlines to implement those solutions that were not available maybe before. Thanks.
Thank you. All right, Olivier and Rui, very quickly, please, and we'll wrap up.
Yeah, okay, I do it very quickly. I fully agree with my colleague in Airbus. Of course, we are trying to help the airline to own or to lease the lower operational cost as possible, because that's something important. And what is also very important is to be with them, to help them by different activities, consulting, services, even training. We have a leadership academy for that. But the idea is really to help them and to make some lobbying in front of the big organization, government, or financial communities.
Great, thank you. Rui, final thoughts?
So from our perspective, Boeing has been a partner in Africa for 75 years. We want to be there for the long term. We have been working with our airlines to help them with payment plans if they needed, to adjust the services we provide to them. So we will continue that partnership approach with them, and do some extra activities like helping them training, thinking about the future, planning for scenarios, whatever we can to help them get through with COVID-19.
Thank you very much. And just one final point that came from the audience, which we'd like you to think about and take forward with you as we close the session, is how, when we come to the point of vaccine distribution, especially now that we've seen announcements that a vaccine could be ready as early as the end of the year, what the OEMs will be willing to support, and how we can start to hit the ground running on this particular issue, and what help you need from all of the stakeholders, particularly ICAO and the industry. So we'll come to you on that separately, and as we finish, I'm going to hand over back now to Maureen, just to say thank you to our panelists. You've been absolutely great. You gave some very good ideas on how we can, develop scale, ensure the right competitive playing field, look at the policy enablers like the Single African Air Transport Market and ratification of Cape Town Convention, a reduction of taxes and charges, and so many other issues in terms of operational efficiencies. Thank you all so much for your time. Maureen, over to you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Funke, and a big thank you to all our panelists for sharing with us your views on how we can rewrite the narrative for air transport in Africa. We've heard from each organization on how COVID has affected your respective business. And we've also listened with keen attention on what options are available to airlines to bring down costs, such as the addressing of cost issue based on the economies of scale. We've also had insights in extent on the right regulatory framework and policies that are needed for sustainable African aviation. And then we've also heard of various insights from the panelists on the plans that they have to support African airlines through and beyond the crisis.